should turn quickly. Give me one moment. Okay. Yep, it's okay. We are broadcasting live. Hold on, I'm just going to say welcome to the chat to the New Orthodox Apologetics Live. Okay, and so this is Dcn Joseph Sweden. I'm here with Hieromonk Patrick Ramsey. You're in England. I know that.
Well, Scotland to be precise.
Scotland. Oh, okay. Well, it's good talking to you. I think we have people in Scotland. That's cool. Okay, that's awesome. And so this is great. I was just talking to him. He's our guest host for today. Hieromonk Enoch is he's out traveling or doing something. I don't remember what. But in any case, we're here to answer questions and deal with responses. Well, first off, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
And, basically, as we do every week, we answer questions about Orthodox apologetics. You know, all the questions you want to put in the chat, go right on ahead. And we go on. Today's episode will be a little bit short. For personal reasons, I do have to actually cut it off a little early. Even though now that I found a co-host, I was kind of hoping I could do the 2 hours, but I realized that I'm probably going to have to cut it off early anyway. In any case, we were going to discuss. Okay, just to backtrack a bit. We were basically, I found a link to Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future by Fr Seraphim Rose, apparently online on a Russian site. So it was they did the whole scanning thing, but scan to text, and so occasionally like "and" became "maya" in Russian, but you can kind of figure out what it meant from the visual. But in any case, that thought occurred to me that Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future was written 40 years ago, roughly. And so the point is, we're in that future. And so examining some of the ideas that Fr Seraphim was talking about and looking at it now, and how does that affect us as Orthodox Christians and how we should regard the world, how we should respond to the world and have that ready answer. Father, I've been talking a while, so what do you think?
Ooh, take me a moment to get my thoughts around where to go with that. I think we definitely need to think about from where people are coming now, where their worldview is, how they conceive a world, what their priorities are. And also there's a lot of issues about what they value, what's important to them. Has been quite fundamentally changed from a Christian worldview type thing of morality to something that is quite different. And so they've got different standards and ideas. So one thing that's stressed me about modern times is that Christianity, Orthodoxy, is no longer setting the moral standard to a lot of people in the world. We are setting something which is like sexist and all this sort of thing, because in traditional, these things are almost an anathema to the modern person.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree 100%. I tend to, I mean, on the one hand, it is that is one huge negative, is that the standard being Christianity for the developed world in terms of its standard for morality has been gutted. It's been completely gutted. But I feel like there's an opportunity here. And what I mean by that is Orthodox Christianity started in a culture that was so debased, a Roman culture that was so perverse, and was still able to eventually, obviously through martyric witness, but it was still able to get the message out, or more properly, it was enabled to get the message out. Like, it was possible to reach out to people. And I mean, there's a lot of one of the weird things that I think about when I think about opportunities is in terms of fasting. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Basically, 100 years ago, even some Protestants, and Anglicans definitely, the Roman Catholics, basically held a very similar fast to the Orthodox, with the exception of shellfish, because that's a Western Rite thing that, the papal dispensations of the 7th century. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that everyone was fasting, just 100 years ago. And then somehow through mass industrialization, through, and also spiritual error, and also this influence of this ecumenistic, syncretic view of life that took over, effectively people stopped. It just became meat forever and for everything. And we're in an age now where people are like, I read an article, I think it was in the Guardian, it was like last year or the year before, and it said fasting twice a week is good for your good for your health. And I'm sitting here going, well, they knew that 100 years ago because they felt better about themselves as they did their fasting.
Indeed. Well, I've talked to some people, and there are opportunities now. I think one of the things is how you approach the issue. In this, sometimes you've got to put the Christian package to the side, because we are in an era where Christianity is sort of a post-Christian era. We're almost moving beyond that a little bit, where Christianity is something that's been rejected. So it was where the Roman Empire was something new. It was something that people were ready to, in a sense, listen to. They weren't scared by being called Christian, in a sense. But now there's a sort of a negative reaction of, oh, that's past, that's dead, that's been buried. So you've got to overcome that. But there's a younger generation now where almost under 20s, where even that, they've sort of moved beyond that. Sort of Christianity has been so far out of their vision.
Exactly. That's a great point, Father, is that we are now, because of the new and younger generation, they're open, because they weren't indoctrinated like, my generation or the generation, they weren't indoctrinated to automatically think, oh, religion. Everything generically was religion. They have no idea what religion is. And so at this point, we're dealing with a level playing field. When I've found that, my strongest apologetic was actually my simplest, and that is simply that we are the church. When you say the church, it gives people start to get confused, because, those few clingers on who are just like, that there's this like churchless Christianity, and, that's like lost on people. And so on a younger generation, when you say this is the Church of Jesus Christ, it hits. And I think that people are rightly suspicious of groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons right now, who have used that technique successfully. But we can say that now, and we have now, in this age of information, we have all the data to back it up. Like, it's impossible, in my opinion. I always quote from a paper from a priest of the New Calendar Church of Greece, and Father Enoch quotes from him extensively, because he decided to do after Chieti, he decided he was going to do some research. He wanted to do research on what the foundations of the Western Fathers were, like when did they split. And he came to the conclusion that the Western Fathers were just teaching orthodoxy. And that, this whole thing where we're kind of like trying to reach out to the Pope and stuff, we don't have to do it. We just don't. We could just say convert, come to the church.
Indeed. Yes, and I think another way of reaching young people is to package things slightly differently, use a little bit of the mystical side, or maybe speak about it a little bit more metaphysically. And because I think everybody's stall, in a sense, has a yearning for eternal life, for everyone has a sort of a God desire. I was thinking earlier on today, where everyone really wants to be God. It's this sort of Adam and Eve thing, but they're all chasing after it through the wrong means.
Right.
And to help them to see the world in a different way, I found it was quite effective starting to talk about God when I was doing sort of teaching children. You could do back medical, physical way of how we can only be one God, why there's Trinity and things, and then the connection between God and creation, and how we have to come back into union. Once you sort of set that framework, a lot of people start going, oh, actually, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot more sense than many other things.
Absolutely. And I think that it's funny, because I hate to say this, but, the God of the Catechism of, the Metropolitan St. Philaret of, the 1800s, it still works. It's actually probably more effective now, because it's so concrete than, a lot of the stuff that I've read, coming out of, this or that press, where, the mystical realities, I think people are more aware of them, but I think that they don't understand them because, if you look at the TV shows like the Ghost Hunters and the Ancient Aliens, people are coming up with these ridiculous explanations, but they're obviously ridiculous. And where we can come in and say, no, we understand how this happens. We understand how this body will not decay. We understand how, miracles work because we've seen them. We have 2,000 years of it. And so we have like a huge, I hate to say, a huge database of spirituality to work with, but we have the biggest on earth, with the exception of as Fr Seraphim noted, basically the demon worship that you find in the Eastern religions. But that's a big deal, and I think that, to a younger generation, the fact that, we are, striving for glorified humanity is something that touches people.
Yes, and I've found that putting a sense of the end goal of Christianity helps as well, to realize that the end, the deification. I think this is where Orthodoxy is very strong in the sense of we do become God, but how to become God is not by self-glorification or these. Well, it's impossible through these techniques or anything like that. It's anything worldly. You can't, and you can see everybody is all trying to grasp over eternal life. And even teaching a class of teenagers, you can see they all fit the exact paradigm that the scripture describes what a human being is, all sort of self-independent egos that are and it's just the way their whole behavior is that sense of freedom and self-authority is just what humans are, and it fits the paradigm. But you can sort of start showing that to people. But as I say, theosis, the sense of union with God, is, and then that only through that is true freedom, true eternal life, and everything else is dead and shallow. And you can start showing how everything else is like a parody of the theosis of the Christian path.
Exactly. When you can say, you are consuming God for the restoration of your being to the way it was supposed to be, that's a way more powerful statement than anything coming out of, a lot of these, these modern, variations of the various, Vedanta sects, etc. And the funny thing is, it took my generation to go through it, become shallow about it. I'm a Gen Xer. Become shallow about it, and then give up on it. And their children are asking why, what's really there, and that's the opportunity that we have, and it's huge if we take it. And that's where it's up to us. It's
yes, it's definitely Orthodoxy. One thing that I found difficult and challenging coming out of a Protestant background was just the sense of the other religion. I find Protestantism is very human in a sense. You can just be good, go to church, etc. When you get to Orthodoxy, you're suddenly hit by a reality of an end goal spiritual life from Simon, the new theologian, which, tears, you're expected to have sort of these mystical experiences which you can't control. they're there. It's something so much bigger than you. And you suddenly realize, that the intensity of a life and everything is a lot bigger than anything you possibly imagined. And
it becomes all-consuming.
Yes, and we were just discussing about even type of worship. When you look at the way churches worship, the modern worship is just so human now. It's all about emotions. It's all about something bland about it. I go to a Buddhist meeting and I have exactly the same experience as I had in the evangelical meeting as I went to a Hindu guru, and it's exactly the same thing again. It's this sort of commonality about it. It's sort of a humanness about it. When you go to a traditional Orthodox liturgical service, you've got something very different and feel. I think a lot of Roman Catholics sort of noticed this huge shift since even moving out of the Tridentine Mass into the New Order, how the whole thing became just like the Protestant services. It lost that something divine about it.
I think the big shocker for me, because I was born and raised in the Novus Ordo Roman Catholic Church, and it was a real huge shocker, was that, I mean, my mother, being a Latin American Catholic, had a lot of traditional mentalities and mentality to her, but so I kind of naively assumed, for example, that when I was, that we'd say these 60s and 70s hymns that were, written by these modernists and used in like Lutheran and evangelical churches and stuff like that in the hymnals. But then, I thought that this was this was the tradition of the church. And so, a big wake-up call for me was visiting a friend's Protestant church, and I, was looking at their hymnals, and I thought, I wonder what goofy songs I'll find in here. And I realized they were the exact same songs.
Yeah, well, this is my experience when I was in New Zealand, coming along to Roman Catholic churches from a Protestant background. I went, well, what's the point of changing? They're singing the same stuff as I'm singing in the other church. It's just I've got this table and this sort of mass thing going on, but everything, the whole context was exactly the same as what I was doing in the Protestants. And it wasn't until I sort of came to Orthodox service and went, oh, this is different. This is what I'm looking for. But having said that, it took me a while to move into traditional Protestantism, Brethren Church, where it does much more quiet. There's no musical instruments. They're quite fussy about the one loaf, one cup for all the people. The very traditional ones, and that sort of started making me think in a new way. And then coming to Orthodoxy, everything fell together. My previous Pentecostal life and my evangelical life were fulfilled. Both of them were dead ends in themselves.
But it still led you to the true church. And that's what it comes down to, is that, it still led you to Orthodoxy, because ultimately, I think, and this was an interesting question someone asked, and they said, does the Orthodox Church believe that everybody outside the church is damned? And, of course, the standard answer we always give is we're not God, so we don't really know who's damned and who's not. But the point is that one thing that is useful is that these, I guess, my bishop referred to it once, vestigialism, that there are still tiny pieces, and those tiny pieces are enough for something. They allow a person to eventually see the concrete reality when it hits them. So, in other words, when, as you put it, like you kind of, your Pentecostal and your Protestant life, kind of, you saw the end goal, and it was radically different than what you thought it was. And I think that's going to happen to a lot more people if we're willing to open those doors.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of people search. As I said, one of my friends said, if we just say it in the right way, we show a lot of patience. I think a lot of times too, because the world's morality's changed so much, there needs to be a little patience before that, and definitely not trying to engage at that level until the worldview is converted. There's no point trying to talk to somebody about feminism who's still in their paradigm. You just end up talking past each other. You're talking in completely different worldviews. And I even noticed this with some Orthodox websites where I feel they're sort of pushing things like the sexual agenda of the world now. And when I discuss these matters, their responses to me are just so secular, that they're just talking in the same spiritual. They call themselves Orthodox, but their whole mindset is just still thinking in the secular standards and priorities and things.
Well, now it's interesting because Fr Seraphim, he did touch upon that in the book. So getting to that angle, I do agree. That you will find many people who claim to be Orthodox who are completely secularized. And unfortunately, there has to be kind of a spiritual threshing. And it's not us to do it, it has to be God, obviously. But the point is, I think what's going to happen is, because, I'm looking at it from a perspective as an American. The Papa's Post, I think last year, said that 70% of Greek Americans do not identify with the Greek Orthodox Church. Well, that means the threshing is kind of already occurring. The point is, but now it's time to reach out to all those people who have been forgotten. And I don't necessarily mean, I'm not saying like re-evangelizing the Greeks, that would be great. But what I'm saying is everyone, there was one, there's a common phrase in America, and I forget who it was, which bishop said it, but he referred to Orthodoxy as America's best kept secret. And as many clergy have said since, that's such an embarrassing statement to make because that means we haven't done our job well.
Yes, it has been a sad thing. And I have found it when I've started to teach the basic principles of Orthodoxy, teaching people, they respond very well. When I was with a parish in the UK, and I started doing catechumen classes, and a couple of Greek people turned up, and they said, "Oh, that's what Orthodoxy is about," because they had sort of disowned it, because they had sort of gone off through Roman Catholic schools and things like that. And that's what they thought Christianity was. And then they actually heard it from the Orthodox perspective, the sort of the metaphysic of it and everything. And they went, "Oh, well, in that case, I want to be Orthodox."
Exactly.
And the children were sort of going, "Right, oh, yes, well, this makes a lot of sense. We want to be there." Of course, the parents weren't coming. And I think a lot of it, sadly, a lot of Orthodoxy has become caught up with people bringing it to preserve their ethnic identity, which I can understand and motivation for that. But it just means that a child in the US or the UK associates the church with their foreign ethnic identity. That's part of being Greek. Well, I'm no longer Greek, so I no longer go to that. I'll go to a English church or an American church or something like that.
Exactly.
And I think but this is just a sadness that this is one of my little bugbears and stuff of the Orthodox Church, and I grumble is like with the case in Ukraine at the moment. The Russians and the Ukrainians sort of asking for their own, authority to look after themselves, or you're interfering with me, and the Russians, well, you're under our jurisdiction, respect the jurisdictional rights. And I'm thinking over in the UK and US, I'm thinking, well, why you got any churches over this area for? Because you've already given OCA permission or freedom, independence or autocephaly in the US. So that's the church in the US. You have no canonical right to be there with Russian parishes. And what are you doing in Western Europe? Since when did Western Europe come under the territory of Russia, patriarchate? And because you're over here to look after your people on ethnic grounds, what you're doing is actually forcing the local people to have no church, because the churches here are all defined on ethnic grounds. They're not defined as the church for the local people that caters for people from ethnic backgrounds. So because the church comes across as simply part of a culture to preserve the culture, and each patriarch running across to look after their own nationality, for it's like, where do the locals fit in? And that, I think, has been a sad problem of both the second generation American Greeks, Russians and stuff, who just own the church because it's just simply their grandparents' cultural thing, which they're no longer part of. Whereas if a church had come in and built up the local church, this is the church in America, this is the Orthodox Church, and there was a separate identity from being your national one, I think it may have helped a bit. It was just following the canons, following the standard.
Exactly. And if people just followed the canons, honestly, the whole jurisdictional situation never would have happened in America. But if you, especially, I'm not sure what the situation, how that splintered in Western Europe, but I know that in America, a lot of it, especially in the early 1910s and 20s, it had to do with money. It was just this booming, economic, country, and a lot of people, they built churches with their own funds. I live in a town where there's churches that are 125 years old, and sadly, half of them are empty. And the point is that the whole jurisdictional split, a lot of it started because of money, and unfortunately, I think that is also a motivator with the EP in Ukraine. I'm a little saddened by it. And it's funny because there's, jurisdictionalism is one of the most confusing situations in Orthodoxy in America and in many countries today. And it could be solved if everyone just followed the canons.
Yes. Yeah, and I think it's probably the thing that's damaging the witness of a church most, because I've seen families who want to be Orthodox in New Zealand. The family came along and said, "Oh, we love the Orthodox, but that's for Romanians and things. We're going to go to Roman Catholics because that's the local church." I've had another friend recently leave the Russian church and go to Ukrainian Catholics because at least they are a local church with local bishops and proper structure here. They're not just simply trying to be Russians or Greeks or stuff like that, which is, he said, it's just not catering for me as my heritage. There's nothing here for me. I'm being forced to turn into something else, which I'm not.
I will say, I will say this though, in defense of as confused as the situation is, I remember distinctly when I lived in New York, there was a tiny little Russian Catholic parish, and what I found was the people there. This was back when I was in the Papal Church, and I was going to actually Ukrainian and Ruthenian churches for like 2-3 years, and I finally decided to make it to this little Russian Catholic church. And basically, I realized that almost everyone there is actually a convert. Like, there were like no native Russians there that I could speak.
Right.
And so that was the first thing that struck me as weird. Why does a Russian Catholic Church have no Russian, people? But then, all the chanting went on, and as is habit, as in anyone in any church, whether Orthodox or Union, if you know some of the tones, you may end up starting to sing as well. And I was actually told to shush. I was literally like, someone would, I believe it was the deacon actually walked over and he was like, you're going to have to stop, like during the service. And I was like, okay. I was literally singing Lord Have Mercy. And so I did. And after the service, he offered me a cookie, which I thought was funny. But then I noticed that there was this obsession, they were looking at this, the old Right Prayer book that comes out of Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Like they were fawning over this book, and
right.
I'm sitting here like, this is like live action role play. It didn't strike me as real at all. And I realized that the target was probably like the OCA church that was there, and there were a few churches in the village in that area. But I'm sitting here thinking, it was total fakery, and I told my local Ukrainian Union priest, who just started laughing at me because he thought it was ridiculous. But the whole point is that, that whole trying to do something other than you're not, it does exist in the Papal Church. It's not as common, but it does exist.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it does. But yeah, but I think that's not helped the witness of the church overall, and people come in. I've known families to come in and bounce out again. They just couldn't connect socially. I think the situation in the state is better because Orthodoxy's been there longer. There are far more English-speaking parishes. There are far more English speakers around, and more importantly, the bishops are native speakers. Whereas I found trying to be a priest in New Zealand, when my bishop didn't speak my language, became functionally impossible. You just couldn't communicate. You can't work as a priest with a bishop using translators.
Right.
And it's really frustrating because you're in your own homeland and you have to speak a foreign language to serve as a priest. And I've always found that most disheartening. Is like, well, if I was a Roman Catholic, they're an Italian church, but I don't have to speak Italian, and I don't mind a liturgical language. Even I wouldn't object if everyone had to serve in Greek or something like that, as long as the conversations afterwards are all in the local language. And then I found it most funny when I was in Thessaloniki, busy talking to everybody in English because they're all foreign students chatting afterwards in English. Whereas in the New Zealand church, everyone was speaking Greek afterwards and having Greek coffees and stuff.
Well, one thing that is, I think, probably the biggest problem that Orthodoxy is facing, and that is in anywhere, is the idea that it is an ethnic social club. And I get the problem is this: you can't scare away the people that are there, but at the same time, you can't. And this is where I think a lot of clergy end up becoming disillusioned. You can't mollify them either when they're not doing more for their souls and less for their entertainment. In some ways, I think that what we're noticing, and I've noticed this is in a newer generation of Orthodox, in the younger generation, there is much more zeal. And I think it's because they lack that cohesive social mentality that was present in previous generations. In previous generations, I would say Orthodoxy united ethnic groups in the States. But here, now, that's changed. Those younger people, they're trying to be more connected to the faith, and that's a good thing. But
I think the States is moving past that, but unfortunately, it has a huge loss. I mean, there's a number of Greek Americans who now not part of the church I think is high, and things. Yeah, but a lot of it, for me, a lot of it comes upstairs. If you're done it in the normal way, you look right. And this ecumenism is a huge part of this problem too. Like in the UK,
I was going to go right into that, Father. Yep.
Yeah, it's just because instead of coming over here, we're just a Greek. The ecumenical patriarch comes over here, or we're just looking after Greek immigrants. Do you mind of coming in here? We're not trying to step on your territory. We're not going to have any official here. We're just looking after. But as soon as the ecumenical patriarch defined itself as looking after the Greeks, then they left the Russians and the Serbs with nowhere to go. And so they do the same. And so therefore you get this entrenched thing of just ethnic groups looking after, because the English have got their own church, is a common thing. Therefore you should go to an English church. Whereas if it had been clear that they're heretics, and then the mission came across that the ecumenical patriarch said, look, this is a heretical area, we've got people over there, we need to set up churches, we need to set up a structure there, we need 2 or 3 bishops in there, we need to make sure we cater for Russians or Ukrainians and things, which ecumenical patriarch does, but it needed to be much more proactive, and the chief bishop had to be that type of person who was able to deal with all cultures, and very quickly has to put locals in charge.
Well, I think that, and I hate to say this, but part of that is part of the problem with what happened there is that first off, there's a couple of different angles, and it's like watching like Rashomon or something, and you have to look at the different angles. But in the first place, the Anglicans at that time were trying in America to present themselves as the Western Orthodox Church, and they had enough diplomatic contacts with the Ecumenical Patriarchate to try to present this, and that's part of the reason why Metropolitan Anthony Krapovitsky wrote the thing on how the reception of Anglican clerics was, because they were all investigating this question: is are the Anglicans Orthodox, and so on and so forth. And there were people like Saint Raphael Helwini who were very clear these people were not, but they were unfortunately met with deaf ears. And so what ended up happening was the Anglicans, of course, were playing each side against each other as well.
Yeah.
But then you find, then you deal with the fact that the Ecumenical Patriarchate itself had these problems, with the Freemasonry, so on and so forth. And a lot of these, people, I will say this, is that one person pointed out that the 33rd degree of Freemasonry is actually an honorific that's given to government officials. So when you read 33rd degree Freemason, for example, on Ecumenical Patriarch Meletius Metasakis, that just meant he was a connected individual. Now, I don't believe in the occultist thing, but I do believe that he probably tended along the sides of favoring the Anglicans as opposed to favoring his own people, because there was a diplomatic advantage to that. Which, of course, we know that the Patriarchate in Turkey has not exactly been treated well over the past 300 years. There's a whole new martyrs of the Turkish yoke, etc., which includes dead patriarchs. So, self-interest might have also been a motivator there, but what it ended up doing was it ended up allowing ecumenism to fester. And, granted, now Meletius himself had a program of, ecumenical encounters, etc. But the problem is that ultimately, what that did do is it made the witness of the church, it made it weaker in the sense that it created the whole ethnic subculture,
it allowed that to properly take off, and now it's got there. It's getting very hard to take it out.
Yeah.
And I mean, I definitely appreciate the fact that the Greeks and everything that came across and brought the church with them into places like New Zealand. Otherwise, I would never have had a chance of becoming Orthodox. But as I say, it's more the upstairs management of it at the bishop's level, where they needed to sort of take ownership. This is a mission in here. We need to set up a diocese. We need to say, look, whose territory is this? And only have one church coming in and doing its mission there. And making big effort to make sure that they looked after everybody's ethnic needs around there. That Serbian priests are brought in to look after Serbian parishes. I'm all for, I don't think we should everyone forced to be English all of a sudden.
Yeah, exactly.
but at the bishop's level, but the priority is to start making local churches. So the first thing is, well, this is an English-speaking country. The churches need to speak English. And if there are a sufficient number of people that can't speak English, then we'll provide for them. But we should start making sure that there's English-speaking churches around.
Right.
And just subtle, as I said before, subtle things like just answering the phone in English. It just makes a huge difference. If I get so frustrated with Greeks when they have the first messages in Greek. It's like...
Well, okay, we got our first question, and of course, as I mentioned, sometimes they throw these wonderful grenades. This is a fascinating one. What are your views on post-schism, Roman Catholic saints, and miracles?
Yeah,
I told you. This is.
I open up my. Basically, once you've got post-schism, I wouldn't classify them as saints.
Exactly.
Now, miracles, as we see in the Bible, can be done by all sorts of reasons, backgrounds. It could be demonic, it could be other things. It could even be God himself working a miracle somewhere. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're saved or the church. It's just God's providence and love for all humanity continues out. He looks after all people. Anyone who calls on him to some degree, he looks after. Does it mean that they're part of the church and necessarily saved? No. But it just shows God's love for all humanity, for all people. So they in themselves could very well happen. But it's hard to know what the source is until you get to the details. It could come from anything.
That's true. You don't know the source of said miracle. So we can definitely we can leave out the question of post-schism saints. If you're outside the church, you're outside the church. Miracles can happen. Sometimes miracles have brought people to orthodoxy. I think when you're talking about again, some of the, I hate to say this, but orthodoxy tends towards a scientific perspective a lot of the time, and we generally test spirits. We don't assume that a miracle is a miracle immediately. We're skeptical in that way because a lot of people claim miracles that aren't real. Your thoughts?
The Orthodox, we are very believe in miracles and saints and angels and all the rest of it. Whenever one is reported, of course, we actually quite skeptical until proven otherwise. And that's more of a healthy attitude, especially in spiritual life. If you get visions, dreams, or anything of that, you generally doubt it unless someone tells you otherwise, because it's so easy to get delusions. And same with the thing with saints. They may look like saints, but we don't know. I've tended to get a feeling, this is just an impression, that modern Roman Catholic saints tend to be a bit too human. They're not like Elder Paisius or Porphyrius who are working miracles and prophesying and doing things beyond, transcending any human way of life as the Spirit takes them beyond normal humanity. And the Roman Catholic ones seem to be, they've done a good work, they did a good this and stuff, just good human beings without that sort of divine factor in it, as the ancient saints had. Which was what I was talking about earlier, that for the Orthodox faith is something much beyond what you can be as a human being.
Oh, well, okay. Now, I'm looking here, and I noticed that there's a Bait Lord is here. Hello again, and there's a few people that are here. I want you to know just any questions. We're here to answer them. And so if there are more questions, let me know. Hopefully, Michael 21, that was a sufficient answer, and I hope we can if you have any other questions, let us know. Hello.
Hello.
Oh, you're there, Father. Oh,
I'm
okay.
here.
So yeah, again, it's hold on one second. Just Father, I sent you a quick chat.
Yes, I see that. Yeah.
Okay. Basically, let's see. Are there any questions that we've gotten on Facebook? I haven't seen any there. And I'm looking here. Okay, so if there are no other questions, I was wondering more about the relationship between modern, I guess you could say, ecumenical spirituality and Eastern religions. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Because if you could elaborate on that for just a moment.
Yes. It has been a large influence of Eastern religions into the West. A lot of it has sort of been like a lot of Eastern food. It comes to the West, it's got a lot of sugar added to it, and it becomes Chinese food that you get in USA is not what Chinese food is in China, and so it sort of becomes a pop culture. So I found it's very hard sometimes to define exactly what we're that the stuff that's coming into the West is purely Eastern. And so it tends to have a sort of a pop culture, which is rather shallow compared to the stuff you get into to the East. But a lot of it, I think, this the depth of the spirit, I think, is really what tells Orthodoxy apart from the world. And it's very hard to see this because the humans are very deep, even in our abilities to our physical ability, our mental ability, our spiritual character. If even tapped into demons and stuff, people can do a lot of amazing things, but it's still not the same thing as you experience a saint in the modern time, which is something transcendent. But the way you know it's different is a sense of the humility of the saint, the quietness, the gentleness of the soul. These things is almost impossible to capture without the grace of the Spirit. And it's nothing about show or ego or anything of that nature. It's almost the gifts of the Spirit, the spiritual manifestations are almost by accident, in a sense, from the saint, rather than being sought after as an end in itself. Whereas there's a lot more ego going on in the other things, or it's just simply pushing human abilities to their ends. In which case, like even Eastern monasticism tends to be sort of short term and then may move off, sort of thing, or very heavily focused on physical discipline rather than prayer. But as I said, my experience of bumping into Buddhists, Hindus, Baha'is, etc., going for trips with them, a lot of it's very similar. That they talk the same way as evangelical Christians. They have their testimonies. Well, I said my thing, and therefore this happened to me. I did my mantras and such a thing. It's all very much the same type of thing, and it takes a discerning sense to know it's different from orthodoxy. But until you experience the Orthodox saints, it's very hard to know how to distinguish it. If that makes any sense. Father? Yes, and there's a question about UK time. It is it's quite late for here, as I'm speaking from the UK as well. Why should you trust Eastern fathers over Western fathers? Well, if you become Orthodox and accept the framework of tradition as presented by the Orthodox, you'll find that the Eastern fathers were consistent with that. Some of the Western fathers, or generally up to the schism, were very much in the same spirit as the Eastern fathers. There were certain teachings, certain ideas which were starting to become ground in the Western thinking, and that were divergent from some of the Eastern consensus. And these eventually split away. So they grew to a stage of splitting away. So when we're reading the Western fathers, as if we've accepted the paradigm of the Orthodox tradition, which is a sense of the text, like apostolic constitutions, apostolic canons, reflect the early tradition of the church fairly closely, then yes, we need to watch out with some of the Western fathers, because there's a few little extra bits that started to shift in the way of thinking on certain topics. We should read them, we should take them and regard them highly and not discard them, because they say a lot of good things. Just need to read them take them a little bit of a pinch of salt compared to the consensus of the East. Whereabouts is my church? I'm in Scotland, out in a place called Holy Loch, west of Glasgow, in the little hermitage. But we only have a small chapel for about 5 people. You there, Father?
Oh, hi. So let me take a look here. Fathers, is it possible for you to start a few hours earlier? It's currently 1:41 a.m. UK time. Yes. Actually, Father Patrick is here he's from Scotland, so yeah, it's actually the same time for him, I think. Correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Why should I trust Eastern fathers over Western fathers?
I answered that one, Father.
Okay, great. Now, much Stephanie Dobbs. Are there any other modern Orthodox saints? I know of St. John of San Francisco. There's a lot.
Yes, well, recently in Greece and Cyprus, St. Elder Paisius, Elder Porphyrius, I think Ephraim, was it?
Maybe.
There's another. So there's been 3 saints very recently done, and in Cyprus already they have been painted as icons and saints, and these saints have sort of died in the 1990s, so within most of our lifetimes.
There's a lot of movement for I know among the Orthodox traditionalists, Metropolitan Philaret is being increasingly venerated as a saint, and I think I think he's actually going to be like with St. John of Shanghai. I noticed that his veneration at first was limited to the Row Corps, but then I remember once I was in a Carpatho-Russian church, and this was before the Union of 2007, and they had a tiny little icon of St. John Maximovich. And I said,
"Oh, he's venerated in the Holy Mountain. He's everywhere now."
That's my point. When I asked about it, because I thought it was only a Row Corps glorification, an old lady next to me, she just said, "A saint is a saint is a saint." And I think we're finding, especially among opposition to ecumenism, a lot more people are venerating Metropolitan Philaret. And I think, my synod glorifies him. A lot of synods do. But the point is, I think he's going to be one of those, because now he's more and more popular in Russia. So I think eventually he'll probably also be venerated. There's a lot of modern era holiness. It's just not as common. And then, of course,
there's certainly there. If you go to the Holy Mountain, there's some very holy elders around. Still, I've met a few of them. Bishop Athanasius in Cyprus, I highly rate there, and the monks around him. You could feel the holiness there. So they're definitely there. They're still around, but few and far between, but definitely still modern saints around. And there's a few martyr saints around too. Definitely the Spirit's still working miracles and sainthood today.
Yeah, and I mean, it's I hate to say this, but we're going to probably see more martyrs, because as we have a clearer case to defend orthodoxy, there are a lot more people who are much more invested in killing people who are invested in orthodoxy. I shudder when I think about like the Middle East, where you have many people who are starting to. I've read this news article which talked about how thousands of people are having dreams telling them to go and become Christians, but they're immediately getting killed afterwards because Islam, in general, like Orthodox Islam, when it takes over an area, basically says, yeah, if you leave the religion of peace, you can be killed by your parents. That's terrifying.
Yes, well, I've helped bring a couple of Muslims across to the Orthodox faith, and that is one of their worries about who to tell. They're much shy about it, and some have to be even protected.
Yeah.
From the sort of to always change your identity, especially for big higher profile people. So, that is a case, and so we will find a few martyrs around. Yes, and along with miracle working saints, as icons seem to be still working miracles and wonders, and myrrh pouring. As a beautiful one came to the UK, not local ones. I can't remember the name, but it was just gushing myrrh. It was sort of one of the cloths underneath it was just totally drenched in myrrh.
Oh yeah.
So these things are still living. When I was a Pentecostal, we used to talk about miracles and all the rest of these things. And when I came Orthodox, I said, we still got all those, but it's in the right context. It's about holy people. It's about people of humility, patience, that have done the hard yards of obedience for a number of years, asceticism. Then the grace transforms them. And if you go to somewhere like Mount Athos, that sort of miracle life is part of the fiber of the landscape sort of thing. But it's not something you see necessarily every day, but it's just accepted that the elders, this is what happens. And I like this when I talk about the words of wisdom and things. For me, this is not like an ego gift that bang, bang is handed out to Christians left, right. What happens is as a saint grows close to God, as the Holy Spirit God comes all in all within the saint, then God's wisdom, God's knowledge, God's power, God's presence in any way becomes manifest through the saint. And it just becomes a natural part of your union with God that you just start seeing, talking, behaving, and acting as God does. And this is a real sign of the union with God, the theosis, which occurs in Orthodoxy. But it comes through a lot of years of praying, much humility. We can never grasp for it. It's got to be almost denied through our life, but slowly, if you keep following the path, it happens.
Now, you got another question here from Baitlord. It says, Father Patrick, a Pew Research study says that with current demographic change, the UK will have a Muslim population of just under 20% by the year 2050. What do we do?
Pray.
Pray, fast. Oh, have children.
Actually, having children is a useful thing. Well,
that's usually
again,
how
it just comes down to let's get real with our faith. Why are Muslims so confident to dress and behave like they're in their religious forms, and we Orthodox are too scared to behave like that or to identify themselves? So I think just taking a little bit more bravery, but ultimately a lot of it comes down to each individual person needs to live a life of piety. That's the biggest thing that can help is the parishioners learning to put God first, doing their daily prayers, giving generously to those who ask, loving their neighbors, learning to be patient and kind, and the stillness and quiet, and going to church regularly, communing regularly, because it changes your soul. Your the sense of patience, quietness, and you comes across you, and that radiates out to people around you, and that's where it really starts moving people and seeing those sort of lives. And we keep the good apologetics going as well.
Well, that's actually, I believe it or not, apologetics and being confident in your faith in Christ. That is the biggest counter, because so many people who, I've noticed this, a lot of people who come to Islam have very little understanding of, usually if they were nominal Christians, of any Christianity they had, or whatever you want to call it. But the point is, as Orthodox Christians, we have to realize that even the earliest apologists during the period of Islam, like take St. John of Damascus, for example, they were open and willing to challenge it as a heresy that was in many ways, I mean, I hate to quote St. John on this, but he calls it stupid. And the point is, you take St. Gregory Palamas, and when he was put before a court in, I forget which of the Turkish courts it was, but he boldly proclaimed his faith. The one person said he was blaspheming against Muhammad, so he punched him. But then, after a while, the Sultan realized, maybe St. Gregory was right, so eventually they let him go. But the point is, they realized that they didn't have an answer. And so even at the risk of death, even at the risk of getting hit in the face, even at the risk of, you have to be a man about it. And I'm saying not just for, men, but the point is, you have to be strong in your faith, and you have to know how to answer. I think
and we're, as Christians, and I think this is really true about Orthodox. It's slightly just off the side where people ask, well, how do you know you're in the church, or how do you know an ecumenical council is correct and stuff, and things. Well, part of it is you choose. You say, this is the faith I want to believe. You've got to own the faith for yourself. You're responsible for it. There's no magic pill. But a part of this is the ability to learn, and so you can share with other people. You can speak, and if you get beyond yourself, then you ask the priest to help.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's just saying that we need to act responsibly. We can't just sit back. Every Orthodox Christian is responsible to make sure they grow to perfection in faith, perfection in their virtues and stuff. We're not judged by reaching perfection, but we are judged on moving towards it to the best of our ability from whichever starting point we've come from. So someone might die who is rather rough and ready and barely knows anything, and is glorified, with someone who's an academic who spent years, could have been in prayer, and fails to grow, buries their talent in a sense, is condemned. So it's not about how much, but it's about that constant growing process and things. And that engenders the ability to speak to Muslims. And yes, Islam is simply a heresy. It's not another religion. It's a Judeo-Christian heresy, which is rather silly in itself. It's just gone back to some Judaic type of forms of ritual.
I've noticed that Islam is very Judaic. And even I noticed, I heard of a conversion story. We were talking about it last week, of a guy who converted out of Islam. And he even mentioned the funeral. And that's something that actually is in Judaism as well. If you leave Judaism, they have a funeral for you. They don't generally try to chase you down.
I got to know some Muslims in New Zealand. I went to their homes, and they just do Islam. It's just a reversion back. It's a confused reversion of Christianity. They reject the Trinity because they don't understand it, and they return to some sort of Judaic practices because they consider themselves sort of the true tribe of Israel in a sense. But it's not another religion. This is one of the biggest deceptions in the modern world. That Islam is somehow another religion. It's just like Mormons. As a matter of fact, very fascinated about Mormons. They're just the same. It's got an angel appears a book to a certain prophet. You can have multiple wives. It's sort of very culturally identified religious group, and it's very Judaic. It's got this sort of temple and stuff. It's sort of like the American version of the Arabic religion, which.
Okay, now Father. I know we were going to do an hour, but we've just got 3 more questions, so I figured.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, so let's start with the first one. An Orthodox Christian I talked to said that violence is never justified. Do we do nothing when there is an invasion or school shooting? Confused. Well, first off, I don't know that violence is never justified. It's generally not justified. I'm not going to go into St. Augustine's just war theory or anything like that, but the point is, you can defend yourself. And one of the a recent new martyr in Russia was actually a trained judoka. And in fact, when they tried to kill him, I believe he was in a Muslim region. They tried to kill him, and he literally beat them up. But the point is, eventually they did kill him. But later, like a year later. But the point is that no, there's nothing wrong with defending yourself. And so I don't think that it's just as simple as just saying violence is never justified. We shouldn't resort to it.
Yeah, I think there's levels to an orthodoxy where the standard, you're not wrong if you're a parent defending your children. Matter of fact, you'd be wrong if you didn't in some ways. But there's a level of where self-defense is a normal, natural thing, and you're not condemned for doing that when you're attacked. Now, it's better to run away from being this chance being caught. It's not. So you're not causing any hurt or harm. So it's a better way. And the best way is to maybe die as a martyr, to take the hit on one cheek and turn the other cheek. This is the best path. But these are gradations. So the natural defense is not wrong in itself. It's not the best path. And the best thing is to stand and take it as a martyr. But when you're defending your children, your family, actually you need to stand up and defend them. If you're a nation, you're an arm, you're king, you've got armies of barbarian hordes, you are expected to fight them. And that is defense of a faith. Otherwise, the faith will be destroyed by these barbarian hordes.
I think to sum up, I guess that both of our positions here, it's that if you're dealing with an invasion or a school shooting, you're already in a position where you have very few good options. So you have to judge which is the best option in terms of, the preservation of the faith, the preservation of, whatever lives can be saved, so on and so forth. You have to look at it that way. It can't be as simple as let's fight or let's not fight.
Yeah, that's right. It's complex. It's right discretion. What's wrong is to deliberately go and strike somebody for no purpose whatsoever, or to just fight someone because someone's annoyed you. To quickly go into aggressive action. There's something wrong with your spirituality. Whereas a defensive thing, if it's done in just a calm, you're just reacting into something because you have to. The mentality is different, the spirit is different, and it comes out differently. But if it's done out of anger or anguish or aggressiveness, there's a spiritual problem inside that's driving that, and that's not healthy. That sort of violence.
I agree exactly. Okay, we get to Baitlord's next question. The only country in Europe with a positive fertility rate, which is at 2, as it takes 2 people to create a person, is Turkey, a Muslim country. I worry that Europe will turn into Arabia. Swedanistan is the worst. It will be 31% Muslim by 2050, according to the study. At least on my end, first off, when we start doing projected demographic trends, I don't always trust them. I remember Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb talking about how basically overpopulation would destroy the world within a few years, and it was just used as a way to advance more abortion, so on and so forth. And we never came to the exploding numbers that we did. That said, at least I don't know. I mean, Father, you can chime in with your perspective on this. But again, the answer is still you have to save yourself, save your family, come to the church, and you have to become dedicated. St. Seraphim of Sarav said, acquire the spirit of peace and thousands about you will be saved. Well, if that's the case, then we're terrible at our jobs, because where are these thousands of people? I'm not just talking about clergy. I'm talking about he didn't say like if you're a priest and you acquire the spirit of peace. He said if you acquire the spirit of peace, then thousands about you will be saved. We're not seeing that. We're not doing it.
Yeah, and I think one of the important things about an Orthodox way of life is we should just mind, and in some ways, mind our own business. Just focus on living your life. Don't worry about the world around you. We're not out here to save the world. The average, as you go up the ranks, I mean, the bishops will have more responsibility in that. But the layperson, just get on with living your life well. Look after your family. Make sure you do right. If someone asks for charity and help, you give them some help. You just focus on that and leave the world. The world's going to die. The world is corrupted. The world's going potty. We cannot try to save the world or protect it or have it in our image. It's beyond our control. But we can control our private lives, how we manage our family, and this is what we should concentrate on and forget the rest. And having said about the Muslims, the one advantage about the Muslims is at least they're religious. They do believe in God and they go to some form of religious ceremony. And in some ways, apart from them getting political control, they're better allies in the rife secularization and stuff which is around the world. And one of the biggest destructions of the Orthodox faith is things like fornication. It's rife amongst young Orthodox, which is meaning that we got no priesthood because they are not capable of being priests, etc. This is a bigger problem is a secularization and sexual immorality is a horrible thing. And the Muslims are much better in that area. So it's not necessarily a really bad thing compared to the worldview. And I personally am not always sure whether
I think that's actually a really good point, Father, because when you think about it, people get, I mean, granted, I'm not suggesting people should wear burqas, but what I'm saying is that, first off, most of the outfits that are worn in traditional Muslim cultures were stolen from us. Like the full body wear that the women wear, that's just basically the copy of a nun's outfit. Why Muhammad wanted all of them to look like nuns, actually.
Yeah, it's like walking around Turkey and looking at this is none.
And then, but I think that maybe that was just, maybe that was just his weird thoughts on the process. But the point is, a woman having a head covering isn't a bad thing. That's
matter of fact, Orthodox tradition is women should be covering their heads everywhere out in the town and the stuff. That is what the Muslims are doing, is what Orthodox Christians should be doing. We've just got so far removed from that, and in the modern 20th century, that women don't cover their heads outside is just a hugely modern phenomenon, even amongst Roman Catholics and Protestants.
They used to have head coverings among Roman Catholics and Protestants 50 years ago.
Yeah. It's just really very modern thing that the Christians don't do it, and so they put us to shame. That
we should be looking for ways to outdo them in a sense, and that's we're not. So I think that's something that I think requires a lot of serious self-reflection. Because we need to look at, are we fully living our tradition, as well as, I hate to say it, but probably many Muslims who are not very religious are still doing that. How do we expect them?
Yeah. And the other thing about Muslims is they're just like anyone else, they're just another religious group, slightly stronger on their ethnic thing, but they just start integrating with the society. Their kids just become secularized as well and start losing touch of their own traditions and just follow everybody else.
Exactly.
Just like Orthodox.
And what we need to do is
going to as well.
We can take advantage of that. It's something that we can use to bring these people to the church. Now, I want to get to, and I will get back to this because Baitlord had more to say on this, but I want to get to the next question. It says, how do we as Orthodox answer this? O holy head, Christ our God hath destined by thy apostolic see to be an immovable foundation, pillar of the faith. For thou art as the divine word truly saith Peter, on thee a foundation stone have the pillars of church been fixed. Sergius Epistola to Theodolecta. Okay, that's the 649 Council. Well, I think that first off, the one way we shouldn't answer this is trying to simply assess what that is. The first thing we should do is look at the context in which it was written. And the main context we have to remember here is that the Lateran Council, at that time, and this is something to keep in mind as well, the Lateran Council at that time attempted to become an ecumenical council. The Pope declared it an ecumenical council, and he was Orthodox. He was on the Orthodox side. And this was a period when there was a lot of opposition in the entrenched part of the East, in Constantinople, so on and so forth, but it was an Orthodox council. But in the sense that it wanted to be seen as something it was not. And this is definitely out of context because we have touched on this before. But basically, they were talking about the confession of St. Peter, and ultimately, when it comes right down to it, the council was never recognized as ecumenical, but it was recognized as having Orthodox teaching. In that sense, I would say that if a Roman Catholic handed to you and said, "Well, this is a proof that the Pope has this this power because of what it says about St. Peter in the Council of the Lateran," I'd also point out that the Pope at that time, who was an Orthodox Pope, thought that the Lateran Council was ecumenical, and history has proved him incorrect.
Yes. Well, the other thing is the Orthodox Church doesn't necessarily deny that's true, because if we talk about the Petrine sees, if you include Alexandria and
Antioch, exactly,
they are still sees of the church. And a matter of fact, even Rome is, because Constantinople is New Rome, it carries on the privileges and everything of Rome, which Peter, even if you go take the full Catholic line that given to Rome, it's continued in Constantinople. So in a sense, the Orthodox Church maintains that same. It can be said to be maintained it quite happily in its continuing structure today. So that is one way you can then look at it. Whereas what happened is that the Roman Church distorted its position. It started claiming things that it shouldn't have claimed. It fell into heresy, which was one thing which wasn't guaranteed it would stay away from that, because it distorted itself. But there's much true in the tradition of the church that actually was part of what Rome was doing. So just a lot of it can come down to interpretation.
Right. Okay, well, I hope that answered that one. And now the next question: is there an argument for British, French, German, Italian, etc. Orthodox churches? I think people feel quite intimidated by how foreign churches are. Well, I mean, at least with Western Rite stuff, that was actually Overbeck's original vision. In one of his books, he actually says, "We envision a French Orthodox Church, an Italian Orthodox Church, a German Orthodox Church."
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I'm just reinforcing that. If the church is going to be keeping to its traditional form, then it should be a French church, Italian church, English church, Scottish church, Irish, America, whatever I don't know how you could do it. Maybe an Iowan church, a Carolinian church, type of states. But no, the churches should be mission. The church. It's important for a church to grow in a cult in a local nation and let the nation sort of take ownership of it. Because when we become Orthodox, we don't lose our individual character's personality, nor do we lose our national identity. And it was important that the church took on and became integrated in its national thing, because the tradition lived throughout the entire way of life. But didn't destroy it. We didn't all turn into Greeks or Russians or something like that. We keep our own ethnic identity in the process. But this is where we need to have tradition above that. We need to learn to distinguish between tradition of the church from the customs. And I personally believe that patriarchs should be transnational. They're not national, so that they keep your tradition safe beyond the national customs, so it doesn't get merged into it. I think, unfortunately, Orthodoxy now has got too close to nationalism, and the two have got confused. It's a good thing to be there, to be connected, but we need to learn to also distinguish them. And yes, realistically, hopefully a vision will come that Western Church will grow in France, and they can draw back on their own traditions, like the Western rites and stuff can be brought back into it. Their own style of vestments and things can be reintegrated again, so it takes its own character, its own identity.
I would like to posit on this. Now, one thing that people do talk about is, for example, the use of liturgical Latin. The church didn't use liturgical Latin in the West because that was the development of language at the time. When the schism occurred, the Latin was still being used in the church very commonly throughout, and there were even, I guess you could say, proto versions of the languages forming. If you look in the Mozarabic rite, for example, you can see Proto-Spanish in the Latin. But the point is that with the schism and with the Gregorian reforms, with Hildebrand's reforms, basically that got stunted, and so it became ossified. And so a lot of that they would have had national Western churches, like as I mentioned earlier in the broadcast, when there were actual Polish monasteries at the time using the Western Rite in their own language. And so that was the natural development that would have occurred everywhere if it wasn't stunted then.
Yeah, and I mean, if you go back pre Trent in the West, the Gallican Church is very strong at being the French Church. I mean, the English Church was quite strong being the English. The Irish had their own identity. Now the Spanish did as well. Each one generally had its own character and identity, which is what it should do. But united together in a patriarchate. The Rome twisted it and started controlling and forcing a uniformity that destroyed that, much to the French annoyance. Yeah. But no, definitely there should be that. Each local church should have its own character, but under the tradition, and so keep it unified.
Okay. Now, here's one thing, Baitlord, on the nonpartisan study, I know you want to get back to your original question. I want to cover these, but I will get back to that, and I'm going to talk about it in the context of news and how much that affects our thinking. But I'm going to get to that. Lord Sheckelstein asks, if Jesus advocated a patriarchy, let's just be honest, why can't we ban women from the workforce? The Bible says that women shouldn't work unless it is necessary to raise children. Okay. Well, first off, I don't remember Jesus advocating a patriarchy. At the time, you couldn't speak to women if you were a rabbi, and Jesus spoke to women. St. Mary Magdalene, equal to the apostles, she was active and she spoke very forcefully for the sake of the faith. Banning women from the workforce, okay, I don't even know how that works. And I'll just say this. That sounds like first world problems, and I'm going to call it that because really, if you get to the third world, everyone has to work. Whether you're in a poor country, you're working. You're helping on the farm, you're doing something. There's no point in human history outside of the privileged society in the West that we've become where women didn't do work. That's just not real.
It depends how you define, what the type of work, and our
right.
cultural style of what work is was, as you say, it was from the early community work. Everybody's sort of pitching in their role and things.
Right.
It gets very muddled to work out. I do believe personally that there is a distinction in that the public face is more of a masculine role, and the home is more of a feminine role. And that the women should have their priority to make sure the home is kept well and stuff, and things. If they working to a career to the neglect of their family and home, there's something wrong there. They're chasing after the wrong priority. If a man sits at home all day, makes it look pretty, but fails to earn income for his family, there's something wrong there. They're not sort of. And there are sort of as gender-specific roles which should be a priority, but it doesn't mean that a woman can't work or a man can't help it at home and stuff like that. It's not like a forced vision. It's a priority thing. You do your role, but if you can do other things as well, albeit that we can't start forcing people out of that, especially not in the modern world.
Well, I actually I want to touch on this because this is actually kind of funny. I read an article recently that said it was an article that said, why do Russian women hate feminism? And it was a study on like women's attitudes in Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, this is interesting because during the Soviet period, because they had enforced feminism, because the Soviet state was a leftist state, so on and so forth, and women worked in fascist states too. We'll touch on that also. But the point is that women were forced to work. And so what happened is the dream of women to have a family and raise the family and take care of the home was literally shattered by the political system. And so when the Soviet state fell, a lot of these women started thinking, I really, I'd like to have a family and stuff like that. They started thinking along more traditional lines, and they began realizing that Western feminism, in its form as it is now, this man-hating sort of, women must be in charge of everything mentality, it horrified them. And so they're like, it's interesting that from a natural standpoint, I think that women have the right to work. They can. But the point is, if they want to stay home with their families, that's a good thing too.
What's interesting, you talk about the forced stuff in Russia in the Soviet times, but in the West, it's become an economic necessity now. Because as soon as some women start going out working, those families start earning more money, therefore they can do better. And then other families who want to just stay at home and look after mothers who want to just stay at home being mothers, suddenly they're on a single income and they're in a poverty hole. And so
they have to work.
It has to work to keep up with the Joneses, sort of thing, to get out there. And so the freedom is gone by opening the door one way. You've destroyed the other thing. So, and in Orthodoxy, it's quite clear that I do think this is something which is part of the tradition, that a woman has two choices: either you become a nun or you become a mother. And to try to avoid being a mother is a bad thing, because you're denying the Virgin Mary her role as both virgin and mother. And this is the two paths that a woman really follow down. And so her priorities either become a nun or become a mother, unless you can't, of course, as well as she's able to. Or the other one is she has to stay home and care for your parents for your life. That is also very honorable. But that's basically the three main things: nun or mother. And those are that woman's priorities. If she starts denying being a mother, not looking after kids, she's going to lose her salvation. That's how Chrysostom's quite clear on that, and St. Paul's quite clear on that. So she's free to work and stuff, but she can't do that to deny being a mother, or going under obedience into a monastery and things like that. So and that's a worrying thing about modern feminism, and its way it's affecting our mentality now.
It's creating a world of spinsters and lifelong bachelors, unfortunately. Now I'm going to get to Bait Lord's question. We're getting more questions now as they're coming. Has there ever been a study done on church fathers to find out if most support the papacy or not? Well, it depends on what you mean by the papacy. I mean, if you're talking about Orthodox popes, you're going to find a lot of support for them. You're going to find a lot of opposition, even from other saints, when they do things that are wrong. If what you're saying is in terms of what Roman Catholic claims, for example, on Matthew 16:18, I think the best reference is probably Father Abigute, Father Vladimir's book, The Papacy, where he goes through an exhaustive survey, pointing out that the majority of fathers do not interpret Matthew 16:18 as the Pope, but they interpret it as Peter's faith. So that is, I think that it's a weird question, because, in the time of the early church fathers, the Pope was the protos, and it was just very rare that he said something that was heretical. When he did, they didn't like it.
Yeah, and I think we've got to take the idea of papacy something quite modern. You've got the Bishop of Rome and his function and role or position in the church as a first see in the church. Yes, there's a lot of things out there supporting the priority of Rome. There is a lot of stuff talking about some ways its permanence and stuff. How accurate necessarily it was, it doesn't matter. But there is quite a bit about it. It's important as such. But when it comes to papacy, when you start getting Hildebrand later on, when he's starting to claim the ability to ordain clerics everywhere, there's certain limits on the Bishop of Rome's power. He couldn't call an ecumenical council. He couldn't, because that would imply authority over all the other patriarchs, which he never had. There's no sort of patriarchal synod where he could call them into council. The ecumenical patriarch, by the way, is trying to claim this power. It just cannot exist. Otherwise, he could take the entire church into heresy. One bishop could. And Gregory the Great, Pope Gregory the Great, denied that such a power was possible. And there's a respect for jurisdictions, which Rome started to walk over. So the Pope couldn't walk, or the Bishop of Rome couldn't walk over to Constantinople and ordain a reader in their parish. He had no right to do that because it was under someone else. He couldn't call a council of even a local council in some other part. But he could, so it's a balancing of right. And at Hildebrand, particularly, you see in his false decretals, if they are his, you can see it when you understand the proper privileges and balances everything there. You can see deliberately what he's saying in there, how he's trying to twist that and claim things that were not given before. It was a distortion of it, and that became the papacy, and it became this sort of universal centralization of the church, which it never was before, sort of controlling the church. And that was why it had to get cut off, because it distorted there. So you see a lot of stuff in the early fathers given a high praise of Rome, but it doesn't mean papacy. and we must be careful not to throw it out completely. There is some importance of patriarchal sees and things like that for the unity of the church. And it's trying to dig out the good things from the rubbish. It's not easy.
All right, so we get to the next question. A quick question, sorry, but is fascism banned from orthodoxy? Else I will have to alter my politics, lol. Okay, first off, the only actual form of government that you can find historically blessed by the church is autocracy. So you don't, and that even had its own opposition at certain points. The church generally didn't get heavily into the idea of government until really you find that even the synodal period with Peter the Great wasn't exactly the best time for the church. So I think technically, Orthodox autocracy in general have been, given some sort of sanction. But when you're talking about fascism or any of the socialist systems, you're kind of talking about a headless state. Usually they're basically, in practice, variants of oligarchy. And so I don't see that there's any blessing for that. But I also don't see a massive outcry for monarchy, except in some parts of Russia. But outside of that, the world isn't screaming for monarchs. It would be nice.
Yeah, monarchs do carry a certain symbolic feature. And I know in the UK, the advantage of a monarch compared to a president in the States is a monarch's non-political. And so you can have your allegiance to a monarch. You can have your die as a soldier for your monarch, and the monarch's living for a state that's beyond politics. So whereas in the US, you're stuck with a president, either you're on his side or not, and it sort of divides the society. Whereas the monarch, it's apolitical, can provide a sense of unity for society in something bigger than politics, which is actually a useful thing. And it has a lot of the church. Orthodoxy and Christianity is fundamentally about unity. It's about becoming one with God. And all our social structures are about being one. The whole hierarchy of a church is to bring everyone into one. The whole idea of giving peace during the liturgies, to break any divisions and breaking things. To become saved, we must become one physically and spiritually with each other and with God. That is a fundamental movement in Christianity. And so all the structures that promote unity together, but also structures, this is where fascism is a problem, it's also structures which allow true diversity. And so in other words, there's no racism in the church. Every local church unifies all people of all characters, nations, people, whoever happens to be there. If they're one with Christ in the faith, then they're joined together. And so if fascism becomes a way of saying you are in, you are out because of some human character, then your skin color or whatever, that's completely abhorrent to Christianity. Christianity is all people, whatever make they are, can come together. All that counts is do they have an orthodox, their faith and their piety and as such.
Well, in that sense, I should point out that remember that in other words, Nazism, because of its philitistic thinking, is condemned. If you think in terms of like the fascists like Franco, who actually then restored the monarchy after he literally, killed it off and trained one of the children into, shaped him into his own vision of a king. Effectively, monarchy is, it's again, fascism in an Italian sense. The problem with it again is that there's so much based on state control, and the state control does not have a head. It doesn't have an ordained head. It's just a bunch of guys, like in the American system. You're still dealing with the power of this mindless state. I mean, that's my personal view on that. And I think that, really, I think if you're looking for what God wants, God has a lot to say with God-ordained monarchs, but generally doesn't have very much to say outside of that. So I think that's, I don't see there's no great Orthodox movement in any fascist movement that I've ever seen.
No, Orthodox Church will just get on with whatever system
Right.
is political systems. Yeah, it's not about political systems. If there was an Orthodox, the Roman Empire was probably the idealistic Orthodox system, where you have a unifying head with a multi-diverse empire with a sort of common law across everybody, which everyone's following, but every little area has got its own regional customs and things like that. But there's a sense of a unified around one figure that represents the style of a church in a sense, better than anything. That was otherwise open to abuse, etc.
And this is we have another question here from Baitlord, and he says, I have a long-distance relationship, and I'm trying to turn my German lassie into a Christian, but she got a bit reluctant after seeing verses about women not being able to speak without the husbands. Okay, I realize there's more there with man coming from Christ, but woman from men. Other verses that can seem quite patriarchal. How can I convince her that Christianity is equal between the two genders? Any verses that will convince her? Well, one thing to there's a few different issues here, and the first one is women speaking. As far as I remember, in the New Testament, was basically in the church. It was not actually like women can speak without their husbands. My wife speaks to people all the time. I speak to people all the time, but we don't generally talk to many people of the opposite sex. So in that sense, I tend to always see there's this almost 1950s sort of wanting to see I guess the man does all the talking and the woman says, politely and meekly obeys and says nothing. And maybe that can exist. But I think in the modern era, I hate to say it, but, in terms of, and I say as an Orthodox dealing with the modern world, if all the women are speaking, then as a man who has the right to speak, I probably shouldn't be speaking to all those women. And I hate to say that because what ends up happening is people tend to think in terms of, the way things ought to be. And we have to deal with the reality of how things are and what's the proper Christian response. I would think that if I'm going around speaking to a bunch of women and my wife doesn't speak to men, then I'm a hypocrite. And so ultimately I can't just, you can't just, that's why I don't have women on my Twitter. Because quite frankly, it would be weird. It's weird that I would be, talking to random women, especially about the faith. I'm not saying that, priests, of course, they speak at the, during the service and so on and so forth. But, I think one of the things that's very interesting is that you find a lot in early fathers, and including Western fathers, along with Eastern fathers, is shunning the talk with women. Shunning talk with strange women, especially, women who are not your relation. And so I think that the church has sufficient checks on men to avoid over talking when it comes to women. And women obviously can always speak to women. So the point is, I think that if it's viewed as sexist, it's viewed as sexist because of the fact that men are talking too much. And that may sound weird, but that's my view.
And I think too, some of these issues, you can. I think we said it before. They come from a very different worldview now. People are not brought up in the Orthodox faith, and many even in the Orthodox faith who have been highly schooled in secular schools will have a completely different worldview on things and different priorities. And when you're trying to deal with these sort of issues, it's almost impossible to come to any sort of understanding initially. You've just got to focus on the faith and believing in Christ, the church, and focus on that. These things come later. And this is why in the early church, a lot of the teachings like this were actually kept hidden from people because they can cause scandal. The reason they cause scandal is because they can't cope with them. They can't understand what they're about until you understand the full context of the faith and where it comes from. and why they are there and things. And a lot of times the reasons they're there are to do with issues of mystery. They're to do with issues of iconography, how humanity in a symbolic way represents Christ, presents the relationship between God and man. And this is all represented through symbols and human living symbols. And these are not just secular categories. They're not just humanistic categories. They're sort of divine human mix categories. And unless you're in the faith, unless you have the principles of faith and the principle of God, you can't actually understand why they're there. And it's almost impossible to explain to somebody. So first things first is to bring them into the faith, and just concentrate on the Trinity, on Jesus Christ as the basic story as such, and leave these things for later, because you'll end up just arguing pointlessly for it, and just say there's a reason for it.
I would just point out, of course, the verse that says there's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female in Christ Jesus. And regardless of how we see the roles that the church has assigned, the truth of the matter is when it comes to salvation, there is no difference between man and woman. And they both need to be saved, because they can both go to hell. So in any case, and then somebody said, okay, Baitlord said, so fascism isn't ideal. But perhaps an absolute monarchy is okay. Lord Checkelstein thanked us, so we thank you back for listening. Yeah, I'd say absolute monarchy. I mean, I'm not saying the church doesn't. The church goes with whatever governmental system exists. But have there been Orthodox absolute monarchs? Absolutely, in the East and West. And the point is that's a given. Now, granted, an absolute monarch doesn't have, like, the rights of the feudal lord, which was a made-up forgery, so on and so forth. But he was, if he was a Christian, he had to treat his subjects fairly and as one of his own. So yeah.
In Christianity, everybody's underneath the church, the tradition of the church, including the monarch. And if he goes astray, you'll get the bishops. As some of the great emperors murdered people accidentally, well, not accidentally, murdered people, and they were told off by bishops, and Theodosius the Great went in sackcloth and ashes because the bishop said, "What are you doing?" And he realized his mistake. So, yeah, everybody's underneath the tradition of the church as such, and they've got to stick with it. And as long as people work within that, operate within that framework, yes, you can have. It doesn't really matter what sort of government you have. Absolute monarchs can be fine, but the framework for an orthodoxy is we stick to tradition. We work within tradition.
Now, the next question I see here, okay, no great Orthodox fascist movement, Golden Dawn in Greece, 10% of the polls. Okay. I don't know I don't know how Orthodox that movement is. I know it's a very Greek nationalist movement. So kind of like, but if I remember correctly, they have their issues with certain clerics and so on and so forth. And so, I mean, I'm not gonna get into the complexities of Greek politics in the first place, because I don't know them. And in the second place, because I don't terribly care. But, I mean, it's just it's not my focus in defending the faith. It doesn't have to mix in with politics. And actually that allows me to just quickly tie into mentioning about the whole poll thing, Baitlord, and that is that we have to not focus so much on worldly things. One of the things that I kick myself for doing is I read a lot of news, and I'm trying to cut down on that because it doesn't help me. Like, if you look at American politics right now, it's just like there's so much craziness surrounding the president and whether he's doing something right or wrong. And what's happening is mass demonization of people on a large scale. And it's happening because of our obsession with following the news, following the next thing. And we kind of have to take as much of a step back as we can. I mean, if the media has got us worried about what's going to happen to Christians in 35 years, we really need to take a step back and think about that, because ultimately we might not even live those 30. We, as Saint Isidore of Seville said when it was discussed about the apocalypse, he said, worry in the end, after explaining the prophecies, worry not so much about the apocalypse, but your death, because that is the end for you.
Yeah, that's right. We've got to worry about our own spiritual life and stuff. Don't worry about outside. Make sure you're doing your prayers and doing what you need to do in your spiritual life, and leave God to worry about the bigger picture. And we mustn't forget, God is providentially in control of everything. He is doing, and he's also trying his best to save everybody he can. So yes, we just, but our way we contribute is do our bit, and quite not try to focus on everything. I think there's a modern temptation in the world to try to save the world. There's this sort of media, I want to save Africa, I want to do that and that, but that's a bad mentality. It's not for us to go and try to save Africa. It's a thing for us to give a few cents to the poor man and the beggar on the street outside when we walk past. This is the true way of Christian giving and helping. If we're not doing that, we're deluded if we're thinking we're going to save the world.
The myth of human perfectibility.
Yeah, and again, the other thing I was thinking about is that one of the things I find the world is this demonization of people and the sort of ruthlessness when someone makes a mistake. Whereas if you go to Orthodox, especially Orthodox, when you look at Byzantine society, there's a reality. People are sinners. People make mistakes, and you don't persecute them relentlessly for it. You tell them that they're wrong, but you give them the freedom to make a mistake. You let them, you don't ruthlessly persecute them until they become a complete pain. But there's got to be allowed a true respect of human freedom and stuff as well, and that you don't jump up and down for people every ask little thing that they do. Otherwise, that makes us judges, and it distorts our spirit. We become sort of, and this is sort of critical, judgmental in a way. And I think the media and the demonization of people like Trump and stuff, it's leading to that too quickly. And it's horrible.
Yeah, it is. And it's a horrible state in society that we are in now. But the way out has remained the same for 2,000 years. And that is acquire the spirit of peace. Join the church. It's funny because I know I mentioned this in a previous show, but it was St. Tikhon of Zdansk. Somebody asked the way to salvation, and I realized, there's one more question on confession. I will get to that. But he said, really, for your average person, it's following the fast, saying the prayers, and going to church. Yep. And it's not complicated, but it's the hardest thing in the world once you commit to it. It is the hardest thing in the world once you become obedient. I knew people who they said, I remember hearing of one person, he used to be prolific with his prayer rope until he was placed under obedience to, say, 100. All of a sudden, 100 of them became hard. Because when you place yourself under obedience to the church, you no longer have that control. You're basically saying, God, you're in control. And when people... Yeah,
now, actually, one thing I'd like to say, actually, one of the biggest problems in the modern world is when the Orthodox Christian life requires to be in relationships of obedience. Either you're responsible for somebody else or you're under obedience to somebody else. You're having to think or regard other people. The worst possible situation to be in is being alone and single, because your ego just takes control. And by the time you're 30s, 40s, you just lose it. And the traditional way of life, staying with your parents, under obedience to your parents' home, then moving from that over into obedience of a monastery or obedience of marriage, or the responsibility of care for marriage and family. You need to be in this context to save your soul, really, because this thing about going out, teenagers and young people living on their own, it so ends up just being all about ego and things like that. And that's the worst thing, because, as I said, the church is about unity, coming together and humbling yourself to accept. You've got to be tangibly accept someone else's will as your own. You've got to tangibly do that. Take care of other people. So you become like God by either uniting with his will by accepting the other person, or you are behaving like God by loving somebody, caring for them, making sure that they grow up in the way of truth. And outside these relationships, it's really very, very difficult, because you just get so self-centered. You don't even realize it, that you just become so self-willed. And at that stage, how are you going to unite to God? How are you going to take his will if your whole life is spent just doing your own will? And you say, this manifests through, oh, I did 6,000 things. Well, you're just doing it to your own will. But when you have to take someone else's will and follow that, which is what it means to be united to God, that's where the rubber hits the road. And outside these relationships, it's very hard. And sadly, the modern world is just disintegrating these relationships. And that's just spiritually very destructive.
That's part of why it's part of the task is following that traditional pattern until you have you're in obedience in marriage, or an obedience in monasticism to an abbot. Until that's, until you're in that state, you're kind of moving to and fro, and you kind of have to cling to the church as much as you can, because really, the outside world. It's never been good, and it's as bad now as it was in the time of the Roman Empire. But now this is somebody. Baitlord wrote, "Are there any verses that prove confession?" Now this is a fun question, because in order to understand it, if we look in the scriptures, we see about confessing our sins to one another. But most people don't really get historically how that worked. When people confessed their sins to one another in church, they were making public confessions. And so effectively what this did is it caused a number of people who ostensibly held Christian faith to remain as catechumens until they died, because they were afraid of confessing their sins to the people. And what eventually began to happen is that the priest, and this was something that was, I believe it started in the Celtic Church and moved outward because of its popularity. It may have started in the desert and then made it to the Celtic Church. But the point is, the priest or the abbot of the community became kind of the representative of the people, which is why, there's this question of I absolve or may God absolve. But the point is, ultimately, the priest acts as a representative of the people who you should be confessing to. So, yes, there are verses on confession in the scriptures, but if you really want to do it the way they did it in the scriptures, prepare to confess before the entire church. And that's the way it was done, and eventually moved to a priest. So in a sense, yes, the scripture does point to the tradition of confession, but we should be very blessed that we don't have to confess our sins before the congregation.
But yes, but confession itself in person is a very, very helpful thing, because what I've discovered, if someone doesn't confess, they don't learn to become introspective, to see themselves. And when they get old, they get trapped in bad habits, bad ways, and they cannot hear other people telling them this is not right. And the only way to break this is having a life where you're constantly having to be honest with yourself, honest in front of somebody else, and talking about it, which helps to keep your braveness of your keeps you away from sin. If you have to actually confess that you've done it, it's a shame. It helps with it. But to be honest about, and to constantly checking yourself, constantly living in a life of repentance. And as I say, when you really have to go to someone tangibly, it really makes it real, and it really helps you to do the process. Whereas you think, I'll confess to God in my head, you're kidding yourself.
God already knows.
but you're, in a sense, you end up sort of deluding yourself at what you're doing. And this is why the church always does things in a tangible manner. You really go to the priest. Yes, you're confessing to God through the priest, but to having a tangible person there just makes it really real. And it's very important for our mental health, in the sense, and our ability to grow up as good people, to have that habit of confession and doing it regularly, so that we learn to think about ourselves, to criticize ourselves, think about our habits, learn to repent, learn to change, learn to listen to other people when they make comments, and then we grow into better people. If we don't, we can become very horrible little old men and women who can't listen anymore. And if you ever get dementia or something like that, God help you, there's really no repentance for someone who's trapped in their bad sins, because they've formed the habit, and the dementia and stuff, or Alzheimer's almost physically stops them from being able to repent. So this is why we also must do this when we're young, as soon as possible, get our children trained into it, and so it becomes a good habit, and we form good habits before we get old.
Okay, what is your opinion on Catalonia? Should the police be brutal to keep the country together? I stopped mentally at what is your opinion on Catalonia because I am not Catalonian, and I'm pretty sure Father Patrick isn't.
No, I'm not Catalonian either. In principle, I respect each area having its own sort of autonomy in a sense of sort of be able to have its sort of own ethnic
Within
identity.
the kingdom, it could have some autonomy.
But in the same time, underneath a broader political program, so that's why I was talking about the empire, so that there is a unity, that there's a sense of being part together. We don't fragment into, as humans do, into little individualistic things, into little nations and stuff. I don't like this fragmentation. This is not divine. Divine is a sense of unity, but respecting individual qualities and stuff like that. So it's balancing those between, like a federal state system is where each state can run itself in a certain level of autonomy, but it's unified together. And that's the sort of general principle I'm always for. So anything that's too much about separation, I don't like, but at the same time, I support them if they're being oppressed by other ethnic groups from outside.
Yeah, exactly. Now, let me see. Next question. Is Orthodox confession somewhat like Catholic confession? Do you sit in the box with a stool? Well, there's no box. Basically, usually every confession I've ever seen in Orthodoxy is done by the priest, usually off to the side with an icon of Christ, because you're confessing to Christ. You're not, the priest is a witness. And then basically, there's usually like the epithralion, or the stole, is placed over the head of the penitent, and the penitent recites their sins. There are variants to this, and some of them you could find in, like there's the confessional lists, which is the list of sins that you go over. In Russia, I've even seen where they had little notebooks where it lists the sins, so you could check it off, and then the priest would simply read it and destroy it. So it just really depends on how it's done. But the basic process is similar. If you're talking about like the pre-Vatican II confession, because post-Vatican II, confession can be just sitting down with a priest like you're talking to a therapist, and that's not how we do things.
Well, actually, the Russian practice generally is in church in the sense of it's almost open. There's no hidden away in a box.
Yeah.
You line up and everyone is there, but you don't speak it out loud in front of everybody. It's done quietly in a slow voice with the priest, but people can see that you're going to confession. But they don't hear your confession.
Right.
But generally, the Greek practices confession is done more sitting alone with the priest in the church or something like that. It's not done in a sort of the public way you get in the Russian church. So it's much more, you arrange a time. The priest will be at the church between the hours of 6 and 5. You make an appointment to see him, and then you come in and hear confession more on a one-to-one sit-down basis. Tends to be much more of a Greek.
I think that comes from the fact that usually I've noticed is that Russian parishes are often larger. So I tend to think that might actually just be because, again, you're supposed to guard the communion as a clergyman. And so
I think Russians too, there's much stronger sense of, well, they became accustomed of having to do confession every time you took communion. So if on the Vespers and the night before, or in the morning in the liturgy, everyone's rushing in to get confession so they can take communion. Whereas in the Greek church, there's not that connection. Confession is expected, but once a month, once every 6 weeks, and it's sort of done. It's not connected so tightly in with the liturgy there. Though if you go to Mount Athos, they'll expect you to have confessed within the last couple of months to about 3 months or so. So you're meant to be doing confession, but it's not like every liturgy you confess before, which became the Russian norm, which tended to mean that there's longer queues of people wanting to confess every week, rather than the Greek church where the person's only going once 6 weeks or a couple of months or a month or so, and so the load on the priest is far less per week, sort of thing.
Okay.
There's more time to speak one-to-one. Yeah.
Okay. Now, in Fathers, I wrote in a few lines about the live stream timing. That's open for debate. There is discussion. Some people have mentioned it is too late. So, and I can understand for listeners in the UK and for Father here. It's something I will take into consideration. I feel badly making a decision without Father Enoch normally on that. So, if for the guest shows, I might make it earlier next week, but I don't know if I would. I have to talk to Father because it's kind of like it's not just me. So it's something to look at. Is holy water replaced with holy vodka in the Russian Orthodox Church? Ha ha ha! No. Um, and interesting note though that vodka, if you must know, actually comes from the diminutive of water, and what that means is it's literally like saying little water, and that is because vodka in general, is designed to be like an alcoholic version of water. But no, you can't even drink vodka in general during the fasts. Holy water is just holy water. It's blessed on Epiphany. There's minor blessings, but the point is generally it's it's funny that you mention it because in all honesty, holy water is a great thing to have. And it's generally in the prayer book, you can see uses of holy water. And the point is we should be blessing ourselves with holy water if we have it as often as possible. That's not a bad thing. And I think holy water is something that it's one of those tangible things that we can take from the church and keep and use for ourselves. I'm a big fan of holy water. So that's
the church does a lot of tangible things, and that's as humans with physical bodies, we need physical things to help us connect to the faith and practice and things. And so holy water is one of those things which helps us in that process. It's good.
Okay, now it's 9:56. I think I'm closing out questions. So we will, we do this every week. We'll talk about the time. Father Patrick, first off, thank you for being here. It was great having you on. And to everyone listening, everyone commenting, thank you. And we'll be back next week.
All right. No, thank you for having me.
No problem. All right. Well, everyone have a great night. And have a blessed week.
Thank you. You too.